I was halfway through fastening the clasp on the brooch when she said it. "Don't come to the dance, Grandma. You'll just embarrass me." She didn't look up from her phone, just said it like she was asking me to pass the salt. The brooch slipped from my fingers and landed on the quilt with a dull clink, the kind only old metal makes, heavy with memory, soft with time. I stared at it. A small gold waltzing couple, arms frozen mid-twirl. My mother gave it to me before my first school dance in 1953. I'd planned to give it to her tonight. I smiled, though my teeth didn't quite meet. "Of course, sweetheart, I understand." But I didn't. Not really. I nodded again, folded my hands in my lap, and watched her whirl around the living room in that pale blue dress, the one I helped him just last week. My fingers still ached from the tiny stitches. "It's perfect now, Grandma," she'd said then, forehead pressed to mine. "No one else gets it right like you." Now, I was the thing that needed to stay home. I watched her go, car horn honking, heels clicking, hair curled like we used to do for her pageants. No goodbye. Not even a wave from the window. I sat still for a while, the house too quiet, the lamps humming low. The tea I'd poured an hour earlier was stone cold beside me. On the saucer, a single lipstick smudge, my favorite shade of rose, the same one she used to sneak from my purse when she thought I wasn't looking. I carried the teacup to the sink, washed it, dried it slowly, then went to the drawer where I keep the keys to my old sedan, the one with the broken radio, and the tape deck that still holds our recording of Swan Lake. The sky had turned the color of old cotton, gray, worn, patient. Rain tapped soft against the windshield as I parked 2 rows back from the gymnasium. Far enough not to be noticed, close enough to see the windows light up with color and music. Inside, she was laughing. I could see her through the long glass panes, arms in the air, spinning like we used to in the kitchen when she was little. I'd hum the waltz and she'd stand on my feet, giggling, hair full of flour. "Someday you'll teach someone else," I'd said then, lifting her high above my head. But tonight, it wasn't me who got the dance. I pressed my hand against the glass, not to knock, just to feel the vibrations, the beat of the music through my palm. My breath fogged the window. I wrote her name in the mist, then wiped it away before it faded on its own. I reached into my coat pocket and held the brooch again, warm now from my touch, worn from the years. The clasp still crooked, the gold faded at the edges. She hadn't worn it. I'd left it by her hairbrush, with a note in my careful script, "For your first waltz, with all my love." But it wasn't on her tonight, not on the dress, not on her wrist, not anywhere. I turned back toward the parking lot, the rain falling heavier now. I walked quietly, slowly, the way I used to walk when I was holding her after nap time, when every step was a lullaby. At the edge of the lot, I paused by their family car, reached into my bag, and placed the small box with the brooch under the windshield wiper. Inside was a folded note, 5 words, from someone who always cheered. Then I got back into my sedan, turned the key, and waited for the heat to groan back to life. I didn't drive off right away, just watched, just listened, just remembered. Because some of us dance without music, some of us watch from the parking lot, and some of us love quietly. Not because we weren't invited in, but because we stayed anyway. The smell of flat-ironed hair and lemon-scented dry shampoo lingered in the hallway. I stood just outside her bedroom, listening to the music playing low from her phone, something upbeat, pulsing, youthful. "Can I help you get ready?" I asked, knocking lightly with 2 fingers. Inside, she groaned like she'd just been asked to recite multiplication tables. "I've got it, Grandma." I pushed the door open anyway, slowly, gently, like easing into cold water. "I used to do this for your mama, you know. She could never get her eyeliner even, so I'd—" She was by the mirror, phone wedged between cheek and shoulder, curling her lashes with the same silver tool I once bought for her mother in a drugstore in 1984. Her hands moved quick, practiced, the way teenage girls do when they're getting ready for something important. I smiled and stepped further in. "I could help with your hair. Or maybe your shoes, those straps look like trouble." She didn't turn. "Dad already said he'd do it. Thanks, though." Behind me, from the kitchen, I heard the unmistakable hiss of a soda can opening, followed by my son's voice. "Mom, just let her be, okay? She's a teenager. She's got it under control. He said it lightheartedly, not unkind, but final. A soft brush-off disguised as diplomacy. I'm just offering, I called back. She's fine, he replied. Right, Jules? Fine, she echoed, adjusting her earrings. A dainty pair I hadn't seen before. Not the pearl studs I'd laid out on the vanity tray last night. These were sparkly, trendy, shaped like little stars. I stood there for another moment, not sure what to do with my hands. I tucked them in front of me, then behind my back. Finally, I spotted a stray hairpin on the floor and bent to pick it up. More for something to do than any real purpose. Okay, sweetheart, I said, voice softer now. You look lovely. Really. She glanced at me then, just a flash of her eyes in the mirror. Not angry, not even annoyed, just distant, distracted. Thanks, Grandma, she said, and went right back to brushing lip gloss on with the same concentration one might use to paint a masterpiece. I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind me with care. The kind of careful that comes from knowing your presence is no longer necessary, but still hoping to preserve something delicate in your exit. In the kitchen, my son was scrolling through his phone, leaning against the counter, sipping ginger ale straight from the can. The table was still cluttered with mail and fast food wrappers. No one had thought to set out a snack tray or offer a drink. When did I stop being someone to host for? She's just nervous, he said, not looking up. It's a big night. I know, I replied. She doesn't mean anything by it, he added, finally meeting my gaze. I nodded and gave a small, brittle smile. Of course not. I was the same way at her age. He chuckled. Doubt that. You were probably reading Dickens and baking biscuits from scratch. I laughed politely, though the laugh didn't travel far. Just curled up in my throat and faded. I was braiding my sister's hair for dances by the time I was 12. He didn't answer, just tapped his phone a few more times, then said, Hey, you mind keeping an eye on the lasagna? It's just for afterward. She invited a couple friends to swing by. Of course, I said, already reaching for the oven mitts. As I pulled the tray out, the warmth hit my face, steam rising, the smell of ricotta and oregano wrapping around me like a memory. I used to make lasagna from scratch, 3 kinds of cheese, my own sauce. Now it was store-bought, pre-layered, and still requested only for convenience. I plated it anyway, straightened the napkins, wiped down the counter. No one noticed. The doorbell rang an hour later. Laughter spilled in. Teenagers in shiny shoes, and too much perfume. She dashed down the stairs with her shoes still in hand, her hair catching the light just so. Wait, I called. Sweetheart, 1 second. She paused at the bottom step, hand already on the door. I walked over and held out a small rectangular box, the kind that used to hold pearls or something precious. Inside was the brooch, cleaned, polished, fastened to a velvet cushion. I thought, maybe this? I said, extending it to her. She opened it, looked at it for less than a beat, and smiled. Not dismissively, but gently, almost absently. It's nice, she said, but it doesn't match my dress. She handed the box back and leaned in to kiss my cheek. Thanks, Grandma. And then she was gone, laughing down the walkway, linking arms with a boy I hadn't met yet. The door swung open and shut behind her, catching a gust of perfume and cool air. I stood in the hallway with the brooch in my hand. A few minutes later, my son passed by, checking his watch. You okay, Mom? Yes, I said, placing the box carefully on the side table. She's lovely tonight, isn't she? He smiled. Takes after her mom. And just like that, he disappeared down the hall. I was alone in the kitchen again. The lasagna was cooling on the stove, the plates still stacked. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and stared at the brooch. The little waltzing couple gleamed under the kitchen light, still dancing, still holding on. And me? I waited, just in case someone needed me, just in case someone remembered. I'd set the table before anyone else was awake. Not because they asked, not because they'd notice, but because it was something I could still do without being in the way. 3 plates, forks set to the left, the good napkins, not fabric, but the kind with the faint floral pattern I know she likes. I used to buy them in bulk when she was little, let her fold them into triangles and pretend we were serving guests at a fancy restaurant. This morning, no one noticed. The plates stayed untouched. They grabbed breakfast on their way out. Cereal eaten standing up, toast with no butter, a half banana left bruising on the counter. I poured my coffee and sat down alone, as I often do now. The mug was the same one I've used for 20 years. White, with a crack running down the handle like a thin scar. Jules painted it for me in preschool. Her handprint, now faded to the color of a bruise, stamped crooked on one side. In green, it says, "I love you this much," with the letters all wrong. I used to show it off. Now I keep it turned inward when guests are around. No one had said anything about last night. No comment about the brooch. No thank you for setting up dinner. Not even a, "You okay, Mom?" From my son. They didn't mean harm. That's the cruel magic of it. They just forgot. Forgot I'd stayed up to boil the noodles when the sauce burned. Forgot I waited by the door for her to come home. Forgot I picked up the glittery shoes from the hallway after she kicked them off and stepped over them like they were nothing. Sometimes I wonder when it started. The quiet forgetting. It wasn't always like this. When Jules was 5, she'd sit at my feet and ask me to tell the same story about my first dance over and over. She used to trace the outline of the waltzing couple on the brooch with one tiny finger, whispering, "Someday I'll wear this, right, Grandma?" Like it was a secret between us. Now the brooch sat on the side table where I left it. Unworn. Unasked about. At noon, I vacuumed the living room. Not because it needed it, but because I needed to hear something. The hum filled the space like a voice might. I passed by the hallway where her old drawings still hung. Crayon sketches of castles and stick-figure princesses. I paused in front of one with shaky handwriting that read, "To the best grandma in the whole wide world." I touched the paper lightly. The edges were curling. No one had noticed. In the kitchen, I rearranged the mugs for the 3rd time this week. Then I opened the refrigerator and stared, unsure why I'd done so. I closed it again. Lunch was a quiet affair. A soft-boiled egg, toast, a few grapes. I laid it out on a placemat with little lemons on it, the same one she used to say was so cheerful. She hadn't commented on it in years. I hummed while I ate, not loudly, just enough to hear something steady, and the brooch. It caught the sunlight again. Sitting where I left it, golden and small, glinting as if trying to remind me it still mattered. I reached for it, turning it over in my hand, tracing the dancer's tiny arms. The clasp stuck like it always did. I could fix it, I thought. I could polish it again. But I didn't. I set it back down. By mid-afternoon, I tried to read. My eyes drifted. I got up and refolded the towels, then unfolded them just to do it again. I checked the mail, a bill, a coupon. A political flyer. Nothing personal. It's a strange thing, becoming invisible. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the way people speak over you. The way your chair becomes the one with the squeaky leg that no one bothers to fix. The way your name fades into Grandma and then just silence. I used to leave the brooch out as a hint, like an invitation. Now it sat untouched, day after day, a little monument to something I thought we shared. At dinner, I asked if she wanted help with her homework. "I'm good," she said, eyes on her phone scrolling through some video. My son added, "She's got it handled, Mom." I nodded, the same nod I'd given 100 times, the nod that meant, I won't ask again. After dinner, I did the dishes alone. They thanked me. Offhand, distracted. He went to the den to watch the game. She disappeared upstairs. I found the mug still sitting by the sink. She'd used it this morning, the cracked one with her handprint. She must have grabbed it by accident. I held it, wet and still warm from the rinse. For a moment, I pressed my thumb into the faded green paint. The print was nearly gone now, just a ghost of her small palm. I stood there too long, mug in hand, listening to the sound of the television bleeding through the wall. A laugh track, someone else's joy. Then I washed the mug again. Slower this time. Gentle, careful, like it might break. And when I dried it, I turned it to face outward on the shelf, just in case someone noticed. It was summer. Not the kind of summer you escape from, but the kind you soak in. Thick with honeysuckle, with bare feet on porch steps, with radio songs drifting from open windows. I remember the sound of the ceiling fan clicking rhythmically above us, slicing the heat into manageable pieces. She was 7 then, hair tangled from sleep, freckles blooming across her nose like wildflowers. She stood on the linoleum floor in my kitchen, one sock on, the other dangling from her toes, and said, with all the conviction in the world, "Teach me the spin again, Grandma." I was making pancakes. Buttermilk, with the edges crisp the way she liked. A record spun in the background. Strauss, I think, or maybe just something close enough. The kind of waltz that sways in the body before the mind catches up. "Right now?" I asked, holding the spatula midair. She nodded. "Right now." So I wiped my hands on the towel, took her fingers in mine, and stepped carefully around the flour bin. Our bare feet made soft tapping sounds on the old kitchen floor, and I counted softly, 1, 2, 3, as I lifted her hand and twirled her gently. She laughed, that laugh that only children have, full-bodied and bright, the kind of laugh that makes the walls smile. Again, she giggled, hair catching sunlight, cheeks pink from spinning. The pancakes burned, but I didn't care. We danced right there, next to the stove, next to the ticking kitchen clock and the jar of sugar cubes and the little vase of marigolds I always kept by the sink. "Someday," I told her, lifting her arms again, "you'll teach someone else." She looked up at me with eyes full of the kind of trust you don't earn. You're just given it. Freely. Fully. "I'll teach them your way," she said. "With pancakes." I remember the moment the best because of the brooch. She asked about it as I pinned it to my blouse later that morning. It wasn't fancy, just gold-plated, delicate, with a little couple caught mid-waltz. My mother gave it to me before my first dance, pressed it into my palm and said, "Don't let anyone make you small out there." It was the only thing of hers I wore that day. Even now, I can feel the weight of it, light but meaningful, like a whispered reminder that I mattered, that I came from women who stood tall, who danced even when no one played the music. That summer, Jules begged to wear it. She pinned it to her sundress, upside down, and paraded through the backyard like royalty. She wore it to the grocery store, to the mailbox, even to bed one night before I gently unclasped it and placed it back in its velvet box. "Not yet," I said. "Someday." She'd nodded, sleepily, and whispered, "Promise you'll keep it safe." "I promise." Now that brooch sits in silence on the side table, its dancers still frozen in that eternal spin, and she hasn't looked at it in weeks. I think about that day, about her tiny hand gripping mine, about the record player crackling, about the smell of overdone pancakes and honeysuckle through the screen door. I think about the way she used to look at me like I held the sun in my pocket, and I wonder when it changed. Not overnight. No, it never is. It's a slow turning, like a record left spinning long after the music stopped. You don't notice the silence until you suddenly realize you've been dancing alone. That kitchen is quieter now. The marigolds are gone. The sugar cubes replaced by something healthier. The record player boxed up in the attic. But the brooch, it's still here. Still gleaming. Still waiting. She came down the stairs slower than usual that evening. That alone gave me hope. Her heels tapped cautiously, like she hadn't yet grown into them. One hand trailed along the railing, not for balance, but out of habit, like she did when she was younger, when her legs were shorter and the world taller. I stood just outside the kitchen, holding my breath like it was a glass I didn't want to spill. I'd set the brooch back on the hall table, not in its box this time, but open, visible, an offering, a reminder. She reached the bottom step and paused. Her dress shimmered in the soft porch light, pale blue, just like I'd imagined. She looked beautiful. Not just in the way young girls glow when they dress up, but in the way a memory glows. Soft edges, gentle warmth. My fingers gripped the corner of the tablecloth I'd been straightening. "You look stunning," I said. She glanced at me, then past me, then at the brooch. I saw it. Her eyes lingered, just long enough to stir the hope I hadn't meant to have. She stepped forward. 1 pace, 2, and I imagined it, her reaching for the brooch, letting me help her fasten it. Maybe even a smile, a whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." Something small, something that would stitch the day back together. But instead, she picked up her phone and typed a message. "I'm getting a ride with Lily's brother," she said, eyes still on the screen. My son emerged from the hallway, keys in hand. "You sure you don't want me to drive you?" She shook her head. "I told you. We're meeting early for photos." And then she turned toward the door. I stepped forward. Wait, just a whisper. Just enough to slow her stride. She looked at me, not unkindly, not coldly, but like someone glancing at a weather report, detached, brief. Love you, Grandma, she said, already reaching for the handle. She didn't see the brooch, or maybe she did, and chose not to wear it. The door opened. She walked out into the dusk, heels clicking on the concrete, curls bouncing with each step. I watched through the window as she crossed the lawn, laughing into her phone, the porch light haloing her for one perfect second before she disappeared. The door swung gently shut behind her. Click. That was the sound of hope being folded back into itself. My son passed me in the hallway, glanced at the table where the brooch still sat. He didn't say anything, just gave that soft, tired smile he wore like a coat these days. Light, thin, enough to keep out guilt, but not the cold. She's just being a teen, he offered. I nodded. Of course. He reached the fridge, pulled out a soda, and left again without another word. I stood in the hallway for a long time. The house had that particular quiet, not emptiness exactly, but the quiet of things left unsaid. The waltz from earlier still played softly on the old radio in the corner, like background music to a scene that had ended long ago. I sat down at the table, turned the brooch in my hand, still warm from the light, still unworn, still waiting. I reached for a napkin, folded it carefully, and set the brooch inside. A small box sat near the fruit bowl, the one they kept for keys and mail. I opened it and tucked the brooch gently inside, then placed the lid on top. It was foolish, I suppose, to think tonight would be different. But that's the thing about love. Even after it's been overlooked, outgrown, even forgotten, it still shows up, sets the table, polishes the silver, waits at the bottom of the stairs, just in case. I didn't plan to drive there. It just happened. The house was too quiet after she left. Not the peaceful kind. The kind of silence that crowds you, presses at your ribs, reminds you how much space is left when no one speaks your name. I wandered from room to room like someone had misplaced me. The lasagna still sat on the stove, lukewarm, untouched, 3 plates laid out. I hadn't bothered to clear them. They weren't dirty, just irrelevant now. I found myself in the hallway again, near the front door. My coat was still on its hook, my shoes lined up neatly below. The kind of neatness that only exists when something hasn't been used in a long while. Without thinking, I reached for the keys. The brooch was already in my pocket, wrapped in a napkin, small and warm like a secret you're not sure anyone wants. The sky outside had turned to ink, streaked with the last soft light of day. I climbed into my old sedan, shut the door, and sat there for a long moment before turning the key. The engine whined, then caught. The windshield was dotted with fresh raindrops, just a mist at first, then more. By the time I reached the school, it had become a steady patter. Not violent, just persistent. The kind of rain that seems to come from inside the clouds, quiet and tired. I parked far from the entrance, near the edge of the lot, where the trees leaned toward the road like old friends trying to listen. The gymnasium windows were lit, their yellow glow pouring out into the dark like laughter escaping a house where you're not welcome. From this far back, I could barely make out the faces, just shadows in motion, someone twirling, someone jumping into a hug, arms thrown around each other. Joy so casual, so careless, it ached to witness. I leaned back in my seat and stared through the rain as it traced paths down the windshield. Tiny rivulets, each carving its own way down glass that hadn't been washed in months. And there, in the center pane, a glimpse of her. Jules, laughing, spinning. Hair shining under the gym lights. That same hair I once brushed while she sat between my knees, talking about her day like I was her whole world. I watched her move across the dance floor in borrowed heels and borrowed time, her world wrapped in friends and freedom. Not once did she look outside. Not once did she think to wave, to wonder, to check. She didn't know I was there, or worse, she knew, and didn't care. I reached into my pocket and took out the brooch, unwrapped it slowly, like it might burn. It lay in my palm, gold dull beneath the dome light, the couple still dancing, still holding each other. it felt heavier than I remembered, like it had soaked up every unspoken word I'd carried that week. Every, "Can I help?" met with silence. Every, "You look beautiful," met with a glance past my shoulder. Every small effort to matter that landed like dust on a shelf. And I realized something in that moment. Not all erasures are cruel. Some are just easy. It's easier to forget the woman who remembers your birthday than to remember hers. Easier to outgrow the hands that once tied your shoes than to ask how they're doing. Easier to dance where the music is loud than to sit quietly beside someone who loved you before you could spell your name. I pressed the brooch to my chest and closed my eyes. The rain deepened, a rhythm against the roof, like a lullaby with no singer left. My hands, thin now, veined and unsteady, rested on the steering wheel. The dashboard clock blinked 8:14. The same time my husband used to come home from work. The same time the phone used to ring when Jules was little, her saying, "We made muffins today," and me listening like it was gospel. Now the clock blinked in silence. I didn't cry. There weren't tears left. Just a tiredness that had soaked into my bones like the rain into the windshield. Not sharp, not sudden, just slow, complete. The brooch sat in my lap, and I sat in the dark, unseen, unneeded, uninvited. A grandmother in a parking lot, waiting for someone to remember. She twirled again. Inside the gymnasium, her arms stretched wide, her laughter catching in the light like a sparkler on a summer lawn. Someone sprayed confetti from a can. Flashbulbs went off, the kind of joy that demands to be witnessed. But not by me. Not from where I sat, behind glass streaked with rain, at the edge of a parking lot that didn't even have a name. My breath fogged the window, and I wiped it away with the sleeve of my coat, the one with the loose button I never mended. It left a smudge. I leaned forward anyway, hand resting against the cool glass, and I saw her, my granddaughter, not the baby I once rocked to sleep with a damp forehead and clenched fists. Not the little girl who insisted we use pink candles on every cake, even mine. Not the child who asked me once, "Grandma, how does the moon follow us home?" No, this girl was someone new. She had grown. And somehow, in the spaces between homecoming dances and homework, between unanswered texts and clipped love yous, I had become background noise, reliable, predictable, easily silenced. I let my hand fall from the glass. She didn't see me, not once, but I saw her. And in that strange, aching moment, I saw myself, too. The outline of my reflection hovered faintly in the glass beside hers. Two versions of the same bloodline. One laughing, bright, full of movement. The other, still, quiet, translucent. And suddenly, I didn't feel small. I felt clear. Clear in a way I hadn't in years, because that woman in the reflection, the one with rain-slick hair and tired eyes, she had danced before. In satin shoes with broken straps, in kitchens and parlors, alone and with a man who once whispered that her laugh could change weather. She had taught lullabies, baked birthday cakes, scrubbed tears from scraped knees. She had once been someone's everything. I looked down at the brooch in my lap, still wrapped in its napkin, still heavy, still mine. I didn't feel angry. That would have been easier. I felt done. Done waiting for someone to remember. Done offering quietly and being dismissed even quieter. Done watching life like a movie I wasn't invited to. The brooch caught the faint light of a passing car. The gold shimmered, soft and defiant. I turned it over in my hand, ran my thumb along the clasp. Still stubborn, still bent. Like me. It hadn't changed. Not really. But I had. I didn't know what I would do yet. But I knew one thing for certain. This was the last time I'd sit behind the glass. I reached for the glove compartment and pulled out an old envelope. One I kept tucked with tissues and parking stubs. I placed the brooch inside, along with a note scribbled on the back of a grocery list. 5 words, not a plea, not a guilt trip, just truth. From someone who always cheered. I didn't sign it, didn't need to. Some things don't need names to be known. Outside, the rain softened. Inside the gym, the lights danced. And in my chest, something quiet but firm began to stretch. Not hope, not yet, but something older, something steadier, a remembering of who I'd been, of who I still was. I approached their car, the family SUV, still warm from the ride over, beads of rain clinging to the windows like it had something to mourn. It sat under a flickering street lamp at the edge of the lot, half in shadow. I recognized the scuff on the bumper, the dent near the back taillight where Jules once misjudged the garage turn. I stood there for a moment, the box in my hand, heart steady. I wasn't here to reclaim anything. I was here to give something, on my own terms, in my own way. The brooch rested inside the velvet like a secret no longer ashamed of itself. I'd wrapped it in the napkin I'd ironed earlier that afternoon, soft linen with faded embroidery at the edges. The kind of cloth you don't use for guests anymore, but can't quite throw away. It had served birthday breakfasts, New Year's tea, and 1,000 everyday meals where love was never spoken, but always set on the table. I placed the box on the windshield just above the wiper. Not hidden, not dramatic, just there. Solid. Centered. Then I took the note, creased from my coat pocket, written in my own careful hand. I tucked it under the edge of the lid, the ink slightly smudged from the rain. From someone who always cheered. I didn't linger, didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. I turned, and with each step back to my car, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not with thunder or triumph, but with that same quiet certainty I'd once carried as a young woman, walking out of my childhood home with a suitcase in one hand, and no plan except to love and live as well as I could. When I reached my car, I didn't get in right away. Instead, I opened the door, reached for the old blanket folded on the back seat, and laid it across my lap. It still smelled faintly of lavender and travel, the kind I used to drape over Jules when she fell asleep in the back seat on long drives home from ballet. My hands were cold, but steady. I looked once more toward the gymnasium. The lights still flashed. The windows still pulsed with silhouettes and music. But this time, I didn't search for her. This time, I just watched the reflections, how they danced across the wet pavement like fireflies. And I thought about all the women in my family who had once stood at windows, doorways, train platforms, holding love in their hands and offering it without demand. My mother, her mother before her, and now me. I didn't leave the brooch because I hoped she'd change. I left it because I had. Because I no longer needed to be asked in order to give. Because I wasn't invisible. I was choosing to stand in the open. Because love doesn't beg. It endures. It lets go. It leaves gifts on windshields in the rain and walks away taller than before. I closed the door gently, turned the key, and drove off. Not quickly, but with purpose. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was going home to nothing. I was going home to myself. The house welcomed me with its usual hush. No creaking floorboards tonight, no wind against the windows. Just the click of the door closing behind me, and the faint hum of the old fridge, steady as ever. I didn't turn on the lights. There was enough glow from the street lamps to see my way through the hall. The pictures on the wall blurred slightly, not from darkness, but from the soft veil of memory that always seems to settle on family photographs when you've just done something irreversible. I slipped off my shoes, hung my coat carefully on the same hook I'd used for 20 years, everything in its place. I walked into the kitchen and reached for the radio, the old one with the dial you have to coax just so to catch the station. My fingers found the familiar groove, turned it gently. The room filled with waltz music, faint, grainy, but unmistakably sweet. I set the kettle on, not because I needed tea, but because some part of me needed steam in the air, warmth on the stove, the illusion of comfort made real through habit. As it began to whistle, I moved to the table. There, in the center, sat the napkin. Its twin had gone with the brooch, but this one remained, folded into a perfect square, embroidered edge turned out, like a quiet corner of dignity I'd kept tucked away. I picked it up and smoothed it out with both palms. Then, I reached for the velvet box. Not the one I'd left on the car, the other. The one that had held the brooch for all those years, empty now. I set it in the center of the napkin and folded the corners over it, once, twice, like a careful ritual. Like a careful, Then I opened the drawer where I kept old letters, recipe cards, small scraps of forgotten things. I placed the wrapped box inside, pushed it gently to the back, and shut the drawer. There, not hidden, but no longer waiting to be chosen. The kettle began to whistle. I turned off the burner and poured the water, watching the steam rise, softening the edges of everything. I cradled the mug, the one with Jules's faded handprint, and pressed it to my chest for a long, long time. And then slowly, I walked to the living room. The table by the window still held the framed photo from her 7th birthday. Frosting on her chin, a crown on her head, my arms wrapped around her like the world would never break her heart. I lifted the frame, dusted it, and quietly, I turned it inward on the shelf. Not discarded, not removed, just no longer displayed like a shrine to something that had changed. Because things had changed, not in a sharp, cruel way, but in the way rain smooths stone, subtle, steady, complete. I stood there for a moment longer, hands loose at my sides, the music from the radio drifting like a lullaby for no one in particular. And I knew, with a calmness I hadn't felt in years, that I was done waiting at the window. Not because I'd stopped loving her, but because I'd finally started remembering how to love myself. Not the version they all saw, the helper, the sitter, the background figure who always had a casserole ready, but the woman who once wore that brooch and danced until her shoes gave out. The woman who raised 2 children and taught them to tie their laces and swallow their pride and face the world with straight shoulders. The woman who knew when a goodbye didn't need words. Just a gesture, just a turned frame, just a drawer closed with care. I found the old photo box tucked behind the winter linens, right where I'd left it 20 years ago. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The cardboard was soft at the corners, edges feathered from so many revisits. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat in the quiet, steam from my tea curling into the early morning light. Outside, the world had turned silver with dawn. Rain still lingered on the windows, but it wasn't falling anymore, just resting. I opened the lid. There he was, my Henry. In black and white, standing under the archway outside our old high school gym. A borrowed suit, tie slightly askew, eyes only for the girl approaching him down the steps. Me. The photograph had faded at the corners, but not the memory. I could still feel the thrill in my chest that night, the newness of his gaze, the way he said, "You look like music." That was the night he gave me the brooch. We didn't have much, just a slow dance and one perfect photograph, but I carried that night with me all my life. I placed the photo beside my tea and traced the line of his coat with my finger. That was the last time someone had waited for me. Until now. Because in a way I hadn't seen before, I had waited for myself. All these years of quiet giving, of showing up and being set aside, of hoping they'd remember what I used to be. I remembered now, and in that memory, I found peace. I closed the box gently, placed the photograph back inside, and carried it to the shelf by the window. Not hidden, not displayed. Just there, a piece of me, steady and whole. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need an invitation. What I needed, I had already given myself. And just as I stood to rinse my cup, the soft chime of my phone lit up the room. A message. From her. "Did you leave this?" Attached was a photo, her hand, palm up, the brooch, glowing in the morning light, cradled like something sacred. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. I smiled, set the phone down, and reached to turn off the radio. Then, in the quiet of the kitchen, I held out my arms and spun slowly in place. The music was gone, but I remembered the steps, and that was enough. Because some dances don't need music, just memory.